Welcome everybody to Earthshift Global's September Brown Bag webinar. Today I am pleased to welcome two Earthshift Global team members, Miguel Hernandez and Sarah Donovan. Miguel Hernandez is an experienced project leader in LCA and consumer packaged goods. He has experience conducting and reviewing LCAs across several industries and worked for 6 years at Detergents Ltda in Bogota, where he helped develop TOP Terra, Colombia's first eco-friendly home care products brand, and oversaw recovery and management of over 50 tons of packaging and generated millions of dollars in annual savings through improvements in formulation, packaging, and processes. He earned a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota and a master's degree in environmental management from the same university's business school, where he now teaches LCA and industrial ecology. And Miguel is based in Bogota, Colombia. Sarah Donovan brings both academic and applied LCA expertise with experience conducting GHG assessments and LCAs for products and organizations across several industries. She has developed regulatory reports on low carbon fuels in Canada and conducted research on the climate impacts of beef in Nova Scotia and air transport in the Canadian lobster industry. Her work emphasizes drawing actionable insights for companies and policymakers to reduce environmental impacts. Sarah holds a bachelor's in biology and environmental studies from Davidson College and a master's in resource and environmental management from Dalhousie University. And Sarah is based in Halifax, Canada. Sarah and Miguel have just presented a similar talk at ACLCA 2025 and are excited to bring their insights to you all today. Take it away, you two.
Thanks, Tess. So I will kick us off today. Today, Miguel and I will be discussing how you can leverage organizational lifecycle assessment, or O-LCA, as a foundation of your corporate sustainability plans. So just as an agenda, we'll have an introduction to O-LCA, focusing more on the theory side of things. Then we'll get into how you can use this tool as a foundation of corporate sustainability plans. And then we'll dive into 3 different case studies for how we've used O-LCA at Earthshift Global. So an O-LCA expands the scope of a product LCA by looking at all the environmental impacts of an entire organization in addition to its entire product portfolio. And this looks at all the upstream, downstream, and facility-related activities of an organization. So O-LCAs are typically cradle to grave in scope. They start with the raw material extraction and energy production for product manufacturing through product distribution, product use, and also the product end of life. But it also looks at the full range of organizational activities across facilities, operations, and entire organization's value chain. So this can include indirect upstream activities such as capital equipment investments. So this may include any manufacturing equipment that was invested during the reference period that you're studying, any purchased raw materials for product manufacturing, any purchased goods and services. So for example, any lawyer fees or marketing and research and development. We also look at the purchased electricity and any fuel and energy consumption, any waste, transport and distribution of raw materials to an organization's facilities, any employee commuting, including business travel, and then also any leased assets. So, for example, if a company is leasing their manufacturing facilities or office spaces, that would also be considered. We also look at all the direct activities associated with an organization. So this can include the operation of equipment and its associated energy use at a manufacturing facility, and then also any operation of an organization's vehicles. And in terms of any indirect downstream activities that are considered, we do look at the transport and distribution of different products, processing of sold products. So for example, if a company is manufacturing plastic pellets and these have to undergo further transformation processes such as extrusion, this would be considered under the processing of sold products. The use of any products and end of life, again, any leased assets and any operation of franchises. And within these system boundaries, all inputs and outputs are considered to try and identify where different environmental hotspots may exist within an organization. So O-LCAs are consistent with the greenhouse gas protocol. So indirect and direct activities can be defined under Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 categories. So for example, the operation of any company facilities or vehicles may be considered Scope 1. Then we have Scope 2 impacts from purchased offsite electricity. And then any other indirect upstream or downstream activities may be considered as Scope 3. So ultimately, we can think of an O-LCA in two different ways. The first being corporate greenhouse gas accounting, but we're looking at a full accounting of Scope 3 emissions, and this includes the life cycle impacts of fuels. And then also we look at the addition of other impact categories. So for example, what's the water use or land use associated with an organization's activities? Or we can also think of it as a product LCA, but we're also estimating the entire product portfolio of an organization. And then we're also looking at some other non-product scope one impacts. So for example, the energy use associated with different administrative activities. So there are several reasons that a company may want to conduct an organizational life cycle assessment. So this diagram was taken from the UNEP Life Cycle Initiative Guidance to O-LCA. And it's split up according to three different types of goals. So the first one being societal goals. So societal goals reflect the broader push towards sustainable development. Um, and this supports organizations in measuring and also reducing their environmental impact, but for the benefit of society as a whole. The second are managerial goals. So these provide organizations with a comprehensive view of their environmental performance, and this can help managers make environmentally sound decisions, also how to best communicate these decisions, while reducing costs, but also improving their environmental performance over time. And then the last category are analytical goals. So this can establish a framework for assessing the environmental performance of an organization by identifying different hotspots and also potential impact reduction opportunities to try and improve the environmental performance of an organization. From our experience at Earthshift Global, our clients are often interested in creating a benchmark. So this may be the start of their sustainability journey, determining feasible reduction goals, and identifying best practices of how to reach these goals. So within a typical product lifecycle assessment system boundaries, we look at raw materials, manufacturing, distribution, use, and end of life. But within an O-LCA, we look at these life cycle phases of the entire product portfolio, but we also include the organizational electricity impacts and also any heat, transport, and commuting. So while most O-LCAs are cradle to grave in scope, there are some cases where you can omit, let's say, the use phase or end of life. So, for example, in the case where an organization has no influence of how their products are being used, so in the case of maybe a chemical manufacturer, then we will tend to focus on more of the upstream and facility activities rather than use and end of life where they don't really know exactly how their products are being used. And as I mentioned before, other activities should be considered within the scope of O-LCA. So any impacts from indirect functions or external services, any leisure activities or childcare services and capital equipment that may not typically be captured in your standard product LCA. So in a typical product LCA, we use a functional unit to evaluate the performance, the environmental performance of whatever you're studying. But in this case, we use a reporting unit, and there are a few things that we have to define when starting to think about the reporting unit. So the first is, who is the reporting organization? And in an O-LCA, we don't necessarily have to look at the environmental impact of the organization overall. We could maybe be looking at a specific business unit or maybe a specific facility. Then we also need to try and define what the reporting flow is. So do we want to try and represent results in terms of per ton of product sold over the reference period, dollar revenue, or maybe we want to represent results in terms of how many employees are at the organization. We also need to define the reference period. So typically we look at data over a year. We also need to define whether we want to incorporate primary data from suppliers, capital equipment, infrastructure investments, among other things. So within an organizational lifecycle assessment, it's essential to define the consolidation method. So this determines how environmental impacts are assigned within the organization, and this depends on the legal and also organizational structure of the company. So there are two main approaches, the first being the control consolidation method, and this can be further subdivided into financial or operational control. And then we also have equity share, and this accounts for the impacts in proportion to a company's equity or ownership within an operation. So when conducting the O-LCA, you have to clearly state what consolidation method you're using, because ultimately this choice is going to influence which activities and impacts are considered within the system boundary. So for example, we can look at this diagram here, and we can take Division 2 as an example. We can see that the reporting organization has 100% financial control and 100% operational control over Division 2, but it only has 25% equity share. So this can result in pretty different impacts when allocating among the different consolidation methods. In terms of impact assessment method that should be used within O-LCA, really it should just be appropriate to the stakeholder concerns. So this may take into account the geography of the organization. So if you're in Europe, maybe you want to focus more on the environmental footprint method versus maybe organizations operating in the States. But ultimately, the guidance for O-LCA mandates that it must be an internationally accepted impact assessment method. So O-LCA results are not only valuable for internal decision making, but they can also be used for external purposes, such as voluntary accounting, auditing, reporting, or maybe to gain a market advantage. But if the results are to be communicated outside the confines of an organization, it should be critically reviewed to ISO 14072, which outlines the requirements and guidance for organizational lifecycle assessment. And ultimately, this review ensures credibility, transparency, and also consistency, giving confidence to whoever is reading this report. So an O-LCA identifies where within an organization environmental hotspots are occurring, allowing companies to set goals and determine where they have leverage to make change within their operations. It can also provide a basis for developing different sustainability goals and also tracking the performance against goals over time. And it also provides corporate footprint data for scopes 1, 2, and 3, expanding beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. But an O-LCA should not be used for comparing your organization against other companies because there are potentially differences in system boundaries, consolidation methods, product portfolios, and also reporting units. You also should not use an O-LCA to communicate the impact of a product line or comparing products internally. These require a product lifecycle assessment and also critically reviewed to a different standard. And as with most environmental accounting tools, OCA or O-LCA does have its limitations. So you can use a single product as a proxy for a product portfolio within an O-LCA, but there are some inherent limitations with this because some products are more impactful than others. So the results could be misleading or result in an over or underestimate of impacts. Also, for modeling the purchase goods and services or any capital equipment investments, we do use environmentally extended input-output data. And a lot of the times this data is old. So again, this may result in an over or underestimate of impacts for an organization. And then lastly, O-LCA is a relatively new method. So this tool is subject to change over time. And also there could be different interpretations depending on who is using this tool. So with that, I will pass it off to my colleague Miguel to get into how you can use O-LCA as a foundation of corporate sustainability plans.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we found that there are three specific ways in which O-LCA can be used in the corporate sustainability context. It can be used as a tool for decision making, it can be used for target setting, and it can be used for environmental performance tracking. So the objective of this next section of the webinar is to go through each one of these and present a couple of case studies that illustrate how O-LCA can be used for each application or in each application. So the first application is decision making. As Sarah was saying a couple of minutes ago, O-LCA characterizes the environmental impacts of an organization. And this characterization process normally includes the identification of hotspots or improvement opportunities. O-LCA allows companies to test potential improvement scenarios in order to see or to test different plans that attack these improvement opportunities, and then these results can be used in different decision-making processes. As Sarah was saying, O-LCA goes beyond the physical boundaries of the organization and also addresses the impacts of its supply chain and other indirect administrative activities. So this can be these plans can be related with managerial decisions such as closing a branch or production decisions such as changing a raw material, things like that. Now let's see how this works on a real case study. So this is a case study where we did an O-LCA for an electronics component manufacturing company. This is a company that has 7 product lines and offices in 4 different countries, and they don't manufacture their products. All their manufacturing is outsourced. So in essence, they don't have any Scope 1 emissions. And they came to us because they wanted to do an O-LCA, and they wanted us to be able to capture the impacts of the use of their products, all the impacts related with employee commuting and with home office work as well. So we did the analysis, and this is a snapshot of the results. I'm going to focus on this slide on climate change or the global warming potential results, but as you will see on the next slide, we covered 6 different indicators. So in essence, what we found is that 99% of the impacts in terms of climate change could be allocated to Scope 3 activities. This is quite common for businesses that manufacture and sell tangible goods. And within the Scope 3 activities, there were 2 main drivers of impacts: the use of sold products and the processing of sold products. This processing of sold products represents how their products are being used by their clients. So, sorry, this processing of sold products represents how the products were manufactured by their suppliers. So this put the company on a very difficult situation because their 2 main hotspots were allocated in activities that were not happening in the company facilities. So we decided to change the way in which we were presenting results in order to find a way in which our client could act on these results. Here's another representation of the results, which just shows that the main tendencies that we presented on the previous slide were exactly the same for all the impact indicators that we analyzed. So when changing the way and how the results were presented and presenting them by site instead of by scope, we were able to see that there was a specific site. In this case, we're calling it site D, that was responsible for 81% of the company's impacts. And when our clients saw this raised a big question. They asked what would happen if site D started using renewables um, for powering all their offices. So we decided to run a scenario analysis in which we replaced the electricity source that we were using for site D for renewables, and this is what we found. In essence, the scope 2 impacts the of site D were reduced up to 70%, depending on the impact indicator being analyzed. And can we go to the next slide, Sarah, please? And this represented a reduction of scope 2 impacts in the whole company of 70%. So with those results, the company went back, regrouped, and decided to implement renewables not only on site D, but they decided to start using renewables in all of their sites. So this is a very clear example of how a company can characterize its environmental performance through the use of an O-LCA and then use scenario analysis to test potential improvements that can be implemented in different areas of the organization. And Sarah?
Thanks, Miguel. So now we'll get into how O-LCA can be used for target setting within a company. So O-LCAs can be used to identify different hotspots within an organization's operations. So starting with its indirect upstream impacts, direct facility impacts, and also downstream impacts. And these targets can be set on either a near term, so think 5 to 10 years, or a long-term basis. But ultimately, the target should be defined as a quantitative reduction of impacts to be achieved by a certain year using the reference year from the baseline results in the O-LCA as the baseline. And as I mentioned, O-LCAs are unique because they do go beyond just looking at a carbon footprint, and they encompass other impact categories as well. So this allows companies to track different impact categories to make sure there's no burden shifting that's occurring as they try and reach these targets. So in this second case study, the company was interested in using O-LCA for target setting, specifically in line with the SBTI targets, and also for external communications. So just to add some context for this company, it is a large consumer packaged goods company. This specific O-LCA is focused on one business unit of the larger parent company. So we did use an operational control approach. And within the business unit, there are 15 different manufacturing facilities and one office across 2 countries. And there's several different product lines. Some products are consumed as is, whereas other products are further transformed. So we did need to take into account the processing of these sold products. And within this business unit of manufacturing facilities, I did want to make a note of how interconnected these facilities are. So some facilities within the business unit are actually raw material suppliers for downstream facilities within the same business unit. So given the interconnectivity of this organization's facilities, it was really important to be mindful of not double counting impacts. We also considered all scope 1, all scope 2, and scope 3 activities within the system boundaries. And I also did want to note that this was the first sustainability assessment this company has conducted. So here we just provide a diagram of just how complex and interconnected the facilities are. So to try and simplify things, we did group facilities based on the products that they produce into different clusters. So we did what you would call a cluster analysis. So in cluster 1, we have the corporate office, and then we also have 6 additional clusters within the manufacturing facilities. So we can see that cluster 2 and cluster 3 supply products to 4, 5, 6, and 7, in addition to external customers. And then cluster 4 and 5 supply products to 6, and 7, in addition to external customers. So to try and avoid double counting, we did fully allocate the emissions of the raw materials to the facilities or the clusters that were initially responsible for emitting them in the first place. So for example, the raw materials from cluster 2 would be considered burden-free for clusters 4, 5, 6, and 7, but that's only because we're already accounting for these impacts upstream within the impacts from cluster 2. So we looked at 6 different impact categories, and you can see that across all 6 impact categories, the scope 3 activity, raw materials and packaging supply is the primary driver of impact. And this is largely due to 2 raw materials in particular. Then we have the scope 1 emissions from the on-site energy consumption and generation as a secondary driver of impact across 5 of the 6 impact categories. And then if we zoom in on the global warming potential impact, we can see that scope 3 account for the vast majority of impacts, accounting for about 80%. And then scope 1 accounts for about 20%, and scope 2 accounts for less than 1%. And this trend is largely driven by the on-site energy consumption for scope 1, and then within the scope 3, the raw materials and packaging supply. So the main insights from this analysis were that as I mentioned, majority of emissions are scope 3, followed by scope 1, and this is largely due to the raw materials and packaging supply, specifically these 2 raw materials, followed by on-site energy generation. And this will be important to remember as we get into the different targets that we set for this company. But we also did want to note that there are some limitations to the study approach. So because we're doing a cluster analysis, it will be an underestimate of scope 3 emissions for the downstream clusters, as these are already considered upstream for the cluster 2 and 3. And because it's going to be an underestimate of some scope 3 emissions, we cannot make comparative claims about the relative performance of the clusters or the individual facilities within this organization. So based on the results, we did set some targets for this company. So the organization has the most control over scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. We know that the majority of impacts are being driven by scope 3. But we did want to also address some targets because they're a little bit easier, or I guess the company has a little bit more control over these. So these are recommending that the organization replaces 100% of on-site generated power, any natural gas, and then also any purchase power from off-site with renewable sources by the end of 2030. And then in terms of scope 3 targets set, we recommended collaborating with different suppliers. So trying to collect primary data from these 2 raw materials that are driving the majority of the impacts across the 6 different impact categories by the end of 2030. Then also trying to prioritize sourcing raw materials from companies that set voluntary sustainability goals, such as SBTI, with 50% of the suppliers by the end of 2030 and 75% by the end of 2040. And then also, again, trying to encourage suppliers to incorporate renewable electricity into their processes, sourcing raw materials from suppliers that power 100% of their processes with renewable electricity by the end of 2030. And then lastly, because this is a consumer goods company, they do have some agricultural commodities that are contributing to the environmental impact. So we also recommended committing to no deforestation across the primary deforestation-linked commodities by the end of 2030. So ultimately, the O-LCA was also critically reviewed to ISO 14072, so the company can use this for external communications. And then using the target set, they plan to use them within the SBTI framework in the future. And then lastly, because it is the start of their sustainability journey, they will use the results from this baseline O-LCA as a benchmark for subsequent years to see how their environmental performance changes. And I'll pass it back to Miguel.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so the last way in which O-LCA can be used for corporate sustainability is as a tool for environmental performance tracking. This is a pretty straightforward application. So basically, when O-LCA is used consistently over time, it can be used as a way to track the evolution or the changes in the environmental performance of a company. And this has three specific applications or uses. The first application is that it can be used to expand the performance tracking schemes of a company to include environmental aspects into, into corporate reports or any external reports that are being performed by the company. Secondly, it can be used to track how internal decisions made by managers or by the company affect the environmental performance of the organization. And third, it also helps the company to understand how changes in the context or changes in the market affect the environmental performance of the company again. And one case study that illustrates this is this O-LCA that was done on a chemicals manufacturing company. This specific company has manufacturing sites in 10 different countries in the world, but this O-LCA focused on their US operation where they had two sites. They were interested to calculate well the environmental impacts of their operation, but they also wanted to understand the impacts of employee commuting, again, home office, and product um, product transformation. Sorry, not manufacturing, but transformation. It is important to note that this study didn't include the impacts of the use of the products by the final user because the company didn't have any control on that specific process. So we did a first analysis, an initial analysis, and what we found is that there were two main hotspots that drove the environmental impacts of the company, and those were the processing of sold goods, so how their products were being used by their clients, like transformed by their clients, and the purchased goods and services. Within this last category, we included all the upstream impacts of the raw materials that were being used in their own manufacturing process. So it is very important to note this because that was the real main hotspot of this specific category. And yeah, thanks, Sarah. So this is just another way of presenting the results. Again, this slide shows how practically 99% of the impacts could be allocated to scope 3 activities, which again, it is quite normal for these types of companies. Then they took these results home and they came back 1 year later asking us if we could redo the analysis and evaluate how different changes that they done internally affected that they did internally affected the environmental performance of the company. So we redid the calculations, and this is what we found for year 2. We found that again there were two main hotspots: processing of sold products, again how their products are being transformed in the market, and in this case, we decided to separate the incoming chemicals or incoming raw materials from the purchased goods and service category, just to be able to visualize this as a main hotspot. And in this case, it represented more or less 50% of, of impacts. And once again, everything could be grouped into scope 3 activities. So 95% of the impacts of the company could be related with this specific scope. Now, when comparing the performance of the company in these 2 years, we found a couple of interesting things. First one is that contrary to what they were expecting, the environmental performance of the company was worse. So the environmental impacts per ton of sold products increased in year 2. And they were surprised by this because they were expecting that a couple of internal decisions that they made, like closing a branch and making some changes within their manufacturing process, was going to be beneficial for their environmental performance. So we went back to the data and we tried to understand what was going on, and we discovered two things. The first thing is that in terms of scope 1 activities, On year two, they were able to provide more detailed and granular data of all their scope one activities. So we were able to do a better representation of that specific set um, of activities, and that basically caused an increase of impact. So we communicated this, and they accepted that since in 2022 they were just getting started in their sustainability journey, they didn't have all the data handy. So we agreed that we needed to do some updates on the first model to make sure that things were comparable. And the second, and oh, Sarah, can we go back? Thank you. And the second thing that was interesting in terms of the differences was that in terms of scope 3 impacts, we discovered that they decided to do a change in the way they were selling their products, and they started to target one specific client that used their products for one very specific application that was very impact intensive. So the fact that they were focusing their business to that client, to that set of clients, or to that sector, was causing an increase in environmental impacts. So this showed how a business decision can affect the environmental performance of the company, because it can be a decision that is good for business, but it can also have some repercussions in terms of the environmental performance of the company. So again, this is a case study that shows how O-LCA can be used over time to track the environmental performance of a company. The results can be used as a specific indicators that can be then used in different reports. And additionally, this was also used to understand how, in this case, external factors or business or market factors were affecting the environmental performance of this company. Okay, so in conclusion, as Sarah said at the beginning of the session, O-LCA is a scientific method that uses life cycle thinking to compile the inputs and outputs and calculate the potential environmental impacts of all the activities that are related with a specific company's operation. Once again, it goes beyond the physical boundaries of the company, and it expands the traditional product level O-LCA scope to address the impacts of the company's whole product portfolio and upstream and downstream indirect activities. And then O-LCA can be used as a key component of corporate sustainability plans, because it can be used as a very powerful tool to make informed decisions. It can help in decision-making processes. It can also be used as a tool to understand the environmental performance of the company and then set targets that can be aligned with external guidances or third-party guidances. And it can also be used to track the environmental performance of a company over time and to understand how this performance changes depending on shifts in the market or different decisions that are made by management. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah Miguel. That was excellent. As someone who didn't get to attend ACLCA this year, it was so special to get a little bit of the topics that were discussed there. So I'm excited to read. We have a few questions. I'll read the first one. If anyone has any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A or message me. Right now we have about 5, so feel free to add them on. We have 20 minutes for questions. So for question number 1, how old are the economic values used for the input-output databases used to calculate environmental impacts after expenses and investment data? Are there any updates or new databases in the near horizon?
So one that we've used in the past is the environmentally extended input-output database. And there's also the XEO database. So one is from 2002 and the other is from 2012. Miguel, I don't know if you have any insight onto whether any other input-output databases are in the works.
I don't, but we can check into that and maybe send an email to whoever asked this question.
Okay, that sounds great. So we'll follow up. I'm going to copy this question now, and we'll follow up with the question asker.
Yep. Thanks,
All right.
Tess.
Yeah. Number two is, can the results from an O-LCA be used to feed a company's GHG accounting report?
Yes, they can. The only thing that needs to be noted is that um, GHG reports only require companies to report the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And since O-LCA uses life cycle thinking, it also includes the scope 3 activities in all their calculations. So if you want to use them, if you want to use O-LCA report results for GHG accounting, you need to be sure that you are using the scope 1, that you are covering the scope 1, 2, and 3 um, boundary.
Thank you. Okay, another question. First, the question starts with thank you so much for the presentation. So I always like to give credit where it's due. And this question asker is curious if the interest of the companies in O-LCA is usually only on the carbon portion, or if they also have a careful look for other impacts as well.
It it depends, and Sarah, please feel free to jump in. It depends. Normally, companies are super focused on carbon, and that's where the GHG portion of things gets involved. However, there are some companies that are also doing materiality assessments, and the results from those materiality assessments tend to be specific resources or indicators of interest for that company or those stakeholders or their stakeholders. So in some cases, the companies that are looking for an O-LCA are also interested in those impact indicators that are material for them. So it depends on each client, I guess.
Thank you. Okay, question number three. What's the main difference between an O-LCA and GHG accounting?
Well,
Um,
I guess Miguel
Go
already
ahead.
covered part of it with the life cycle thinking, but then also with an OLC, obviously you have all these other impact categories as well, that are captured within the analysis. So maybe some targets you're setting are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but then maybe increasing impacts in other categories. So it really gives you more of a holistic view of the different targets you're setting and potential reduction opportunities. But yeah, I think probably the main one would be the life cycle thinking that Miguel already highlighted.
Thanks, Sarah. I think what interests me most about LCA is that holistic view, but I imagine there's some challenges there too, which some of which you talked about. So another question we have that I'm excited about is how do you account for impacts of services like advertising, internet use, etc.?
Sure. So I can take this one. So usually when we're collecting data from clients, we'll collect how much they've spent on different services, and then we use the input output database to try and represent the impacts of these different services. So there's a long list of different services included within these databases. So those will transfer monetary investments into environmental impacts.
Awesome. Okay, last question. Are product level LCAs compatible with O-LCAs?
Yes, they are. As Sarah said at the, let's call it the theoretical section of the webinar, you can think of O-LCA as a collection of product level LCAs plus different administrative activities such as I don't know, the power used in office work, advertising, legal services, and all of that. So yeah, can be done.
Well, oh, I think we have one more. Okay. If the goal is to improve sustainability, multiple impacts will be quantified and evaluated. Do you need to implement MCDA to help the corporation?
Um, I don't know about you, Sarah, but I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with MCDA.
Me
Neither am I.
neither. Let me see if there is a chat. If this was an anonymous attendee, um, I'm seeing multi-criteria decision analysis in a quick Google search. Um, But if the anonymous attendee wants to leave, oh, yes, they commented multi-criteria decision analysis. So let me reread the question for you. If
Okay.
the goal is to improve sustainability, multiple impacts will be quantified and evaluated. Do you need to implement multi-criteria decision analysis to help the corporation?
That's a very good question. Again, without having much knowledge on MCDA, I would say that it would be helpful because you would be considering different variables at the same time. As Sarah was saying, and as Tess said a second ago, probably the biggest thing about O-LCA is its holistic approach. So through the use of this specific tool, you could be like um, leverage into that quality of the methodology and really leaning into it and helping the company.
Another question. How do we get the EF, which I'm assuming is environmental footprint, so there's an acronym I do know, when we collect the data in terms of cost? So how do we get the EF when we collect the data in terms of cost?
So the data, so the input output database can be, well, you have it in the lifecycle assessment software. So for example, SEMA Pro. So you can translate that into different environmental impacts. So you just select the different data sets depending on which purchase good or service you're trying to model. And then when you run the analysis, it will, you can run it using the environmental footprint method, and it will spit out the different impacts according to the different indicators that you're interested in. Miguel, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that would be great. That's great. Sorry. So, oh, actually, the only thing I would add is that the thing to consider when using input output data is that the functional unit is based on a monetary value, but the structure behind the data set is as any traditional data set that we use in LCA softwares. So we have a comprehensive lifecycle inventory behind that monetary value that we can use to build our models. So that's how it's translated into impacts.
Right, another question. I appreciate all of the engagement this session. This is great. This question asker heard about the scope 3 being around 90% of the contribution of GHG in one of the companies. Usually, what would you say a safe range that we see is on the relevance of scope 3 and the total impact of companies?
Great question. It depends on the company. On manufacturing companies like the ones we analyzed in this case, um, 90% would be a good number or a good starting range, I guess, between 90 and 95%, 99%. There are other companies that offer services or banks or companies like that where scope 3 is not going to be that big. So you also need to take that into account. One thing that we haven't mentioned is that in order to model the scope 3 activities of all these companies, we use secondary data. One thing that we normally recommend is that after presenting results and identifying hotspots, it is very useful to try to collect primary data on those scope 3 hotspots that we found, because that can definitely refine the analysis.
Well, thank you, Miguel and Sarah. That was the last question. And thank you to our audience for being so engaged and interactive. I learned a lot this session. I hope you all did too. And I hope to see you all in October. Our speaker and title will be announced soon. So look out for our newsletter, The Shift. Check out our website and follow us on LinkedIn. Thank you again, and I will see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.